Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you for being here today. I appreciate your want and inclusion to want to learn something new. I'm very excited to talk about this topic today because it has been something that we've wanted to talk about for a long time now, and something that's always sort of in the background of what we do. And today's topic is going to be Generation Z. Are they primed for addiction? And this is by myself, prevention educator Ruth Del Pino. Um, and I always want to talk about who I am because I feel like this is important to understand my background. Hello, my name is Rita Pino. I'm a prevention educator for the Mercer Council on Alcoholism and Drug Addiction. I am the Mercer County Grant Program Coordinator. I have a Bachelor of Arts in Global Studies, Political Science, and American Studies. I'm certified to teach English as a foreign language, life skills training, and leadership. Also, I always want to talk about why this presentation, because sometimes when people hear about these things, one, it can be really scary to hear about it for the first time, but two, it's to understand what the basis is for the discussion that we're going to have today. So first thing is, this is not to scare you. Second thing, this is to inform you. These are facts. This is empirical evidence. This is something that will inform the way that you interact with this generation. This is also not a parenting class. You are the best parent for your child. You know them the best. You've probably known them longer than they've known themselves. Also, the other thing that I want to keep in mind, and for anyone that's attending right now, to understand that this is not just a parenting presentation. This is for anyone that works with youth or for anyone that wants to understand youth in a different capacity. Also, understand that my perspective is shaped by my approach and my learning experiences. So as a prevention educator, we have access to a lot of different types of education, a lot of different types of webinars, seminars, and many outlets of education that really let us know and hone in on our craft and what we like to do and what we do for a living. But also understand that this is a perspective of a prevention education perspective. So that means it's evidence informed and some evidence based. Evidence informed meaning that any programs that exist with the council, at the Mercer Council, like footprints, Too Good for Drugs, life skills, and things like that, those practices and those approaches and those coping skills that we learn through those programs and through those curriculums, we put them into the presentation here, and I discuss them based around what I think can fit and what I think is necessary to get the point across for these presentations. And what I mean by some evidence-based is that I collect information from a lot of different places. All of them are verifiable resources, but essentially what it means is that anytime I find a study, anytime I find any research, anytime I find something that is intriguing but may actually not seem like something that you'd know about or something that may not seem true, I always put the resources at the end of this presentation, especially on the YouTube channel, and I send them out afterwards so that people know what they're looking at. And you can go through those resources with me in case you have any questions or any concerns. And once again, you can always reach out to me through the email listserv that we have going. So today we are going to be talking about a lot of different things. If anybody didn't notice, I put instant noodles in the background because I thought it was very clever, because we are going to be talking about instant gratification. Now, what does this look like? There are a lot of different things that instant gratification looks like. And for us to understand that there are a lot of different ways that we can discuss instant gratification. I know a lot of time people say the youth today are so obsessed with instant gratification. And in a way, yes, they are. So let's sort of talk about that. Let's understand why that is an issue and why it is a lot of different things. You know, anything that is going to be throughout this presentation, understand that it's not just going to be good and bad or good for them or bad for them. It's going to be anything that we make it, meaning instant gratification in its own right can be very informative. It can be something that lets people exactly know the direct feedback that they have given the action that they had done. So that can be very good for adjusting behavior. It can be very good for interacting with an environment. But there are a lot of different ways that instant gratification can prime a brain to possibly have a substance use disorder. Now, there were quite a few different studies on here that I wanted to sort of discuss. There is one that I have not put up there just because the URL was so long, but there was a study that was done at Bucknell University, and what they had done was they were sort of looking at millennials specifically, so my age group, anyone that's 25 to, I believe, about 40, give or take. They essentially were talking about how millennials are primed for instant gratification because of the ways that we grew up, because of the technology that we had interacted with. And some of the some of the predictions that they had that I thought were really interesting was something that I wanted to start with. So they said the need for instant gratification is likely to become even more pronounced in the generation born after 2000. So this is what we're talking about, Generation Z. More than 70% of children age 8 and under had used a mobile device for some type of media activity. So that means playing games, using apps, watching videos. And this was in 2013, which was up 38% from 2011. So within that two-year time span, there was a 38% growth. And this was according to a survey that was done by Common Sense Media. So when we are sort of looking at this, that this is something to look at, right? And it also said some 38% of children under 2 had used a mobile device for media activity. This is up 10% from 2 years earlier. So that's still a jump from 2011 to 2013. So we sort of discussed what does this look like and why is this a concern? Now I sort of want to reiterate why it can be a concern and what that sort of looks like from an internet safety standpoint and why instant gratification is instant gratification in the first place. And it's because of the technology that Generation Z interacts with. So we're going to start with someone, her name's Jessie, and she is an internet safety expert. And this is a TED Talk, and we're going to take just a snippet of it just so we can understand what that looks like. And she's very charismatic, and I highly suggest checking this out after we are done here, because a lot of the points that she makes, I sort of found the part that summarizes a lot of those points, but she extrapolates very heavily on them throughout the presentation. It's a 13-minute long video, but it is very informative.
Part of the brain is going wonk, 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 wonk. And the frontal lobe that says, yeah, that's not a good idea, not so much. So how could this possibly go wrong? So in all of the possible issues in internet safety, here's what I'm not going to talk about today, right? I'm not going to talk about sexual predation. I'm not going to talk about the fact there are 750,000 sexual predators online at any given moment, like now, and now, and now. They're not looking to hang out with us. They're looking to troll your son's Instagram so that he can sit in his basement and look at the pictures from your last son's baseball tournament. I'm not going to talk about the fact that your daughter's probable cyberbully is her best friend, because in 50% of the cases, it's always the best friend. In 58% of the cases, children cyberbully out of revenge because they've been victims themselves. We're not going to talk about that. We're not going to talk about the fact that 11 and 12-year-old children are routinely engaging in sexting behaviors. And the fact that in the best case scenario, they can be publicly humiliated. In the worst case scenario, they're losing scholarships, losing job offers, and possibly going to jail for felony child pornography. We're also not going to talk about the fact that your children, yes, your children, your darling, sweet angel babies, are consuming copious amounts of pornography. That the new age of onset of pornography consumption is 8 years old. That the new onset of pornography addiction is 11 and 12 years old. We're not going to talk about that. Aren't you glad? We're not going to talk about any of those things. So even if we ignore all of the obvious risks of unsupervised, unmonitored, unfettered access to internet, even if we ignore everything Nick said about internet addiction, about dopamine levels, even if we ignore all of that, there's something else. I have Ginsu knives to sell you. Wait, there's more. We're raising an entire generation of children who will never say, I don't know. Do you remember your parents saying to you, stop saying you don't know? My mother used to say this all the time, only she's Cuban and has an accent. It sounded different. But it was the same thing. I don't know. Now nobody doesn't not know. Because if they're sitting in the cafeteria and someone goes, what's the name of the guy that sings that song, I like big butts and I cannot lie? Who sings that? They don't go, I don't know. 5 phones come out of 5 back pockets, like a ricochet, and they find out. So what's wrong with that? What's wrong with finding all those answers right away? That's not necessarily the worst thing in the world. The problem is what instant gratification leads to. The problem is that in many schools, did you know, they're not teaching the state capitals anymore? Not teaching that. And so I asked, why would you not teach the state capitals? This seems kind of important. Well, and the reason that it was explained to me is that, you know, if kids really want to know that the capital of Ohio is Columbus, they can kind of just look it up. Yeah? But that's like saying that the process of the memorization, the process of the learning, the process that has to take hold in order for the child to retain that information doesn't have intrinsic value.
So I think that she is a very charismatic speaker. So if you can, I would suggest checking out the rest of that TED Talk. But what she really essentially is saying, and what she had said at the beginning, which unfortunately was cut off just for a second, was saying that there are a lot of different parts of the brain that are developed at certain points of our lives. So a lot of the time, we have discussed this many times before. We have a brain expert, Vanessa DeRosa, here actually, and she talks a lot about the brain and how, to protect it and to make sure that that we're developing our brains in the best way possible. But for us to understand also is that your brain doesn't stop developing until about the age of 25, and that's an average point. So what that means is that when there are children interacting with technology and substances and things like that, there's a lot of stuff that can go wrong. And it kind of rewires a habit. It rewires the brain to sort of be activated in a different way. And what she said basically was saying that there's one part of the brain that is really it really is attention seeking for pleasure, for instant gratification, for things that is a reward system. Now that's one part of the brain. And the next part of the brain is the prefrontal cortex, which is the decision-making part. Now that decision-making part is not fully developed until the age of 25. That's the last part of the brain to develop, meaning that all the decisions that children make when they are making decisions as children is for instant gratification. It's for pleasure seeking purposes. It's for reward systems. It's for giving into the things that are super sugary and exciting and not very good for you, because that's the reward part. That's the part that's very, it sort of helps with the sort of saying, oh, like I just want to do all the fun things right now. So that's the part of the brain that is really activated. And so what she essentially is saying that is that instant gratification in its own right can, and she only talks about the bad parts because she does talk about internet safety, but understand too that instant gratification can give us a lot of knowledge, especially when we have technology in our hand. It tells us exactly what we need to know. I myself have been at dinner with my friends and said, what's the capital of, or how many what's the population of XYZ country, and I've looked it up, and that was the information that I got right away. And that's the good part, that we are a smart generation because we know the facts, we know what that looks like. But the process of learning, that the process of being curious, is not always there. And that's what she's really saying, is that the process of being curious, the process of thinking through cause and effect is shortened. That time frame is shortened, meaning that that instantaneousness is sort of impedes the growth of those thinking processes. Now, another thing is that we have a lot of stuff here that I had sort of put on, but I just want us to understand that there are a lot of different ways that we can talk about this. But this in particular, this link that I found really exciting, was saying that TikTok and YouTube and Generation Z, and the way that they interact with a lot of social media, Generation Z has actually changed the way that people market to them. And we're going to be talking more about that on the next slide, but I just wanted to preface with that to sort of get that conversation going, at least if we were thinking about it, because when we're talking about instant gratification, social media is the king of instant gratification. It's the part that says, you know what, you want it, you have it, it's right here. So we're going to be talking about that more. Right, here we go. Next slide. Okay, so usage, social media. A lot of questions on social media. Usage, how? Well, it's usually through a device. It's usually through a tablet, any sort of technology piece, a laptop, a cell phone. People have become really creative these days. They can find it on a lot of different things. People have Apple Watches and they have social media on that too. When social media can happen anywhere. And I think that's the part that we are sort of looking at here, that there's no mitigation factor. And why? Social media can be a lot of things. It can be a social part of life. It can be something that gives way to people understanding what the trends look like for that time. It gives way to people connecting in a different way, especially during COVID. It's one of the only ways that children had during that time when we had lockdown, was to connect with others. And now, what we're sort of looking at here is social media advertising is definitely different for a lot of reasons, but when we are looking at this and the usage, we're saying that, I'm going to refer to a study that was done by the Pew Research Institute, and they said about 71%, 18 to 29 years old, say that they use Instagram, compared to 65% for Snapchat and about 48% who use TikTok. The results were released on that Wednesday. This was in the year 2018. So, and it was about for more than 1,500 Americans. So when we're talking about Generation Z, we may be talking about the older generation, but that is a lot of users, and that usage rate has only gone up. Now, the other thing that we are looking for here is that when we are talking about social media advertising, I just want to click on this for a second, is that Gen Z has reinvented the way that we look, my apologies, has reinvented the way that we look at media advertising. Now, there are a lot of different reasons for this. Oh, it's always the pop-ups, isn't it, right? So there's a lot of reasons for this, but when they are looking at here is that there is so many different ways that the TikTok especially is growing. And it says young people aged 16 to 24 spent an average, admit that they spent an average of 7 hours per day online in 2019, 3 of which were spent exclusively on social media, according to Global Web Index. Now, Twitter, Facebook, and Snapchat were actually slowly growing, while newcomer TikTok has actually grown rapidly in 2019 and especially in 2020. Also understand that these changes come as advertising budgets. So these companies themselves are expanding their advertising budgets to $517 billion globally by the year 2023, which is taking 61% share of total media expenditures, which is mind-boggling in my opinion. Imagine spending billions of dollars to advertise to Gen Z because they are actually accounting for 40% of global consumers. So that is something that is a lot to work through. That's a lot to understand, saying that there is actually a disparity between age groups because 40% of the people that are consuming media are Gen Zs, meaning that there is a good chance that when you are advertising something, when you're giving something away, a Gen Z is going to look at that and say, I'm going to buy that, or I'm going to look at that, or I'm going to scrutinize that in some capacity. Now, I also want to, TikTok is definitely a huge contender, and I always try to put it in my presentations because of the way that Gen Z interacts with TikTok, but also understand that I actually just looked up the hashtag anxiety because I sort of wanted to see how Gen Z actually talks about their social anxiety and their anxiety in general on social media. And when I looked at it on Tuesday, so today is Thursday, that was 2 days ago, it was 7.2 billion views. Let's see how many views it has today. 7.5 billion views. So that means 300 million views more. And this is obviously concerning for a lot of reasons. And people are looking through the anxiety hashtag where they can actually help people work through their anxiety, which I find fascinating because there definitely is a support system there. But also understand that Gen Z are more willing to talk about their social media, on social media about their anxiety and their mental health disorders than most other generations. And in a way that sort of feeds into the loop of talking about your anxiety and possibly helping it, but it also can make it worse because social media is definitely a catch-22. But there are a lot of views on the hashtag anxiety, so I just wanted to share that. And TikTok is a huge platform, meaning that 7.2 billion views is not something to not scoff at. So here we go. And also, when we are also talking about social media, and I sort of wanted to put this in there because I really did want to talk about this just for a second at the very least, was that social media in a lot of ways is something that a lot of people use, and it can be something that is really helpful to someone. It can be something that helps a person through a lot of things, feels connected. And Amy Argeria and Chiquita Johnson, who are prevention educators at the Mercer Council, did an amazing presentation on is social media a drug? And I will link that presentation below in case you wanted to check that out. But when we are talking about social media, a lot of people say it connects people. But actually what we're finding is that this study that was done in August of 2019 was saying that Gen Z is actually one of the loneliest generations. And the reason why we are talking about this, the Addiction Center is a great resource, by the way, is one of the loneliest generations because, and there are a lot of numbers here, but, and they said there are a lot of different ways that we can look at this, but they surveyed 20,000 adults aged 18. And this is by the UCLA loneliness scale to tally scores on a scale of 20 to 80, identifying those that scored above a 43 as being officially lonely. An astonishing 43%, 2 in 5 Americans sometimes or always feel isolated from others. Now, that's a little bit less than half. That's a big deal. And so when we're talking about social media and we're talking about how Gen Z loves to use social media to stay connected, also understand that there may be an adverse effect to social media, that there may be an adverse effect to being at that age group. There may be an adverse effect to experiencing the things that they do in the way that they do. And this is in 2019. This is not in 2020, which I can guarantee the numbers will be skewed for that as well. Once again, if you want to respond to anything, you can put that in the chat, but these are all things that we want to talk about as we're moving forward. Now, I put hashtag Ask Reddit just for a simple fact that anybody here that's gone into Reddit, I know that it's sort of like a it's a blog website, so a lot of people have communities that they follow, hashtags that they follow, tabs that they follow, and there is a community tab called Ask Reddit, and there was one in particular tag that I wanted to look at, or that I wanted to discuss rather, was Ask Reddit, why do older generations always hate younger generations? Now, there is actually a really good explanation for this, but before then, I just wanted to say that it is a trend and a perception that certain populations act the way that they do. Just because a population seems to have the majority of trends on how they act does not mean as a collective they always act that way, and as an individual they always act that way. So I sort of wanted to skew that perception by saying that this is actually a video done by a person from Generation Z talking about the high school students that she interacts with, also Generation Z people that talk about how addiction is actually running through her high school, and what she's doing and what she's talking about to sort of stop it.
Worth of contraband from my relatively small school. Featured in the collection you see before you is one of the most popular and rapidly growing e-cigarettes on the market, a Juul. A Juul looks like a flash drive and delivers high doses of flavored nicotine by heating and vaporizing a chemical compound, also called a juice, via a battery in the device. This box is illustrative of the way Juuls, e-cigarettes, and vaping devices have infiltrated my high school and high schools across the country. According to the CDC, in 2018, 21% of high schoolers reported using an e-cigarette in the last 30 days. This is up from only 1.5% in 2011. You can't go to the bathroom at school anymore without being bombarded with the faint but distinct smell of someone drooling. So in order to investigate, learn more about, and bring awareness to this public health crisis, I thought I would go to the people most affected by this epidemic, teenagers themselves. Here are their stories.
If you're inhaling mango-flavored air, you don't think it's nicotine. You don't think it's anything that could get you addicted.
Juuls use cartridges filled with vape juice that is vaporized and inhaled. Along with containing nicotine and chemicals, these vape juices have flavors like juicy mango, cool cucumber, and mint. These flavors sound so fun and innocuous, it's no wonder many of the people I talked to didn't know that when they were inhaling these fun flavors, they were also inhaling nicotine. Something called juicy mango couldn't be dangerous for your health, right?
I started juuling in my freshman year, and I highly regret buying one because I didn't know what a Juul really was.
What I heard from my peers was that once you bought a Juul, and it was easy to just buy it online, you were done. You would be addicted. The amount of nicotine in a single Juul pod is equal to the nicotine in 20 cigarettes, and according to the CDC, research suggests that nicotine may be as addictive as heroin, cocaine, or alcohol.
Sometimes my only motivation to get up in the morning is knowing that I can hit that Juul.
Nicotine is a neurotransmitter that activates the reward system of the brain and causes your body to release dopamine, which is what gives you the effect of the drug. This relationship between nicotine and the brain's reward system can lead to a dependence on the drug extremely quickly, especially in teenagers, because the brain is not fully developed until age 25.
We are the guinea pig generation, and it's not fair.
Because e-cigarettes, vapes, and Juuls are so new, there are not yet long-term scientific studies on their biological effects. And like the Dean of Students noted, my peers and I are, quote, the entire industry's test case. We don't know what's going to happen.
It's scary even though I stop because I just think about it all the time. Whenever I'm stressed out, I think about juuling.
Nicotine dependence can emerge extremely quickly, and once a dependence has formed, trying to stop smoking or using nicotine products will likely lead to withdrawal symptoms, including irritability, stress, and craving the drug.
I was juuling in middle school since I found out it existed. It's hard to quit, and I couldn't if I wanted to.
I remember speaking to the doctor at the school-based health center, and she told me something I will never forget. Quote, addiction is a negation of freedom, she told me. Once you are addicted to nicotine, your choices diminish. With this drug, you're forced to deal with the consequences, financial, personal, and academic, that come with having an addiction. And this lack of choice was a theme running through almost all of my interviews. I can't quit, even if I wanted to, I was told, time and time again.
It's an expensive habit, I know, but I'm willing to spend the money. I have to spend it.
As of July 2018, Juul Labs, the maker of the hugely popular Juul e-cigarette, was worth more than $16 billion. My generation, that becomes addicted to nicotine early and is forced by addiction to continue buying nicotine refills, is what will sustain this company and others like it.
Okay, so there is more to that presentation, but what I do want to say is that, oh, why is it, there we go. Oh, we got something in the chat. Okay. Yeah, so it was made in 2018. And something that I do want to say just for a second is that yeah, I get that there was a policy made that sort of helped and sort of mitigated a lot of what Juul was doing and advertising to younger people and to the Gen Z generation. But yeah, it was really well done. And this was by someone who was also Generation Z, who was saying, I see that there's a problem in my class, in my high school, and I want to talk about this. And it was really well researched. It was really well planned. And I just really like that someone who is of the same age can actually have those discussions with their peers, because it is something that is really important to talk about. And we also have something else in the chat. Give me a second. And oh, and we have a question. Are there any more Juuls made in general without nicotine, or does it always have nicotine? So that is a great question and something that we get asked a lot. And basically what we're saying, we sort of want to reiterate is that I have many presentations on vaping. So if you are curious about that, there definitely are things there. But yes, when a lot of the time when they say there are no trace amounts, I mean, there's no nicotine in this. Understand that they cannot guarantee that because there could always be trace amounts of nicotine in there as well. Yeah, so sorry, Melissa, what were you saying? It says not of the Juul brand. Does it always have nicotine? Yeah, not of the Juul brand.
Yeah, I was just saying Juul proper never made a cartridge without nicotine. However, a lot of people made them to fit Juul, so aftermarket and bootleg.
Gotcha. Okay, thank you, Melissa. I appreciate it. So yeah, Melissa's our vaping expert, in case anybody did not know. We've done presentations together on vaping before. So yes, that is something to understand. And while we're sort of talking about perception here, and I think that's what's something so important is that, yes, Juul definitely had a grip on it. My generation, which was the millennial generation, was going to be the generation that ended nicotine addiction overall. We were really on the trend to do so. And then Juul came out and it was a whole other ball game. It was a whole other institution that we had to interact with and work with. So when we're sort of talking about this, understand that there are a lot of people that were young that started juuling and started middle school and sort of just can't stop. And that also means that Gen Z in their own right could be primed for addiction that way. And I sort of want to talk about quickly when we're talking about this, that we're saying, oh, all of Gen Z smokes Juuls. Yes, it is a trend. It is something that happens. It is something that is a reality. There are times where Gen Z does things on social media that are not smart. There are times that Gen Z does things that they really could think through more. But I also want to say that it's just a trend in general to look at younger generations and criticize the actions of those younger generations. Now, here I actually have something because I sort of wanted to reiterate a point here, that there's a site that actually discusses the history of reading, which quite frankly, before I did this research, I didn't really know there was a history of reading. But what they were talking about is that up until that point, reading up until the 1700s was an out loud activity. It was an activity that everyone had done together. It was an activity that was a social activity, meaning that you would go to taverns, you would go to social events, you would gather around people and listen to people reading these stories. It was much more of an oral history. It was much more of an oral presentation. And over time, more people had learned how to read. And because of the access of books, and because books had become something that was so interesting to a lot of different people, it was actually considered rude to read silently. It was something older people were really scared younger people would take their time away from their jobs or learning a trade. Now, I think that that is really interesting for a lot of reasons, and now that we know that reading is really good for us, that reading is an access to information, reading is giving us different ways to look at things. It helps us think, it introduces us to words that we may not have known before. So the point is that older people will always have something to say about the younger generation. And I think it's sort of like a rite of passage for older generations to have something to say, but also understand that when we're saying kids these days or Gen Z just doesn't know what it's like. Well, yeah, they really don't because they haven't lived through the same things, but they still are having life experiences regardless. Now, there is another thing here that I found really interesting, and this right here is something that I wanted to read over because I just thought it reiterated the same points I was trying to make. That I also want to reiterate that every new piece of technology will have something that the older generation will scrupulate about. It'll be something that will sort of have something to say negatively about the younger generation. It's always going to be scrutinized. And what it says here is that essentially France had lost a debilitating defeat against the Germans in 1880. And there was actually a lot of novels that were proliferated in 1880 to 1914. And France had just recently lost the Franco-Prussian War. And it was perceived that reading was actually part of the national decline. And I'm going to sort of read that section for us to understand. It was a troubled time in France, especially in terms of masculinity. The French thought they were a powerful empire, and they lost in this really quick and humiliating way against the Germans. At the same time, print took off as a mass media. Books became more available and reading rooms were common. Excessive reading by French youth was one of the factors blamed for the country's decline. Adolescents were distracted by all this fiction and poetry they were reading. Now, I find that fascinating for a lot of reasons, but when we're really looking at this, it's to understand that when we say, oh, the younger generation is going to be, worse off than us, it's also to understand that this is not new. This sentiment is not new. Books were considered a mass media. And now that we're talking about social media, it's kind of the same concept. Now, obviously, there are a lot of different areas for social media that we can look at and say, you know what, this is a problem. We're going to look through this, but also understand that even if we say, hey, like Gen Z, they're just lazy. They don't know how to work. They want instant gratification all the time. Understand that that's not a new concept, and it's sort of a rite of passage to be scrutinized that way. So here we go, moving forward. And if anybody wants the link to that, which I find really interesting, it will be listed in the resources below. All right, here we go. So the other thing that we're talking about today is that Gen Z is facing a lot of different things. They're facing marijuana potency specifically. And if anybody is wondering about the marijuana policy, I have already, myself and Melissa Arnold have done a presentation on the marijuana policy. So if you are interested in learning more about that, we already have done that. I also have 2 other presentations on marijuana, specifically talking about marijuana in the brain and how marijuana interacts with the body. But today we're going to be talking about just a few of the ways that marijuana itself has changed the way Gen Z views it. Now, mjfactcheck.org is actually a really good resource for us to look at because they don't really have a lot to gain. They're just an organization that informs about marijuana. That's it. That's all they do. So, and there are some lists here that I find really interesting. And some of the facts here that I think that we really need to know in order to have this conversation is that marijuana potency has increased in the past decades, up about 4% in the 1980s to an average of 15% today. Marijuana extracts used in dabbing and edibles can contain an average of 50% and up to 90%. Now, when we're talking about up to 90%, we can look here. I actually went towards my local THC shops here, and they actually have here 92% THC. So now it can be up to not just 92%. There have been times where it's been 97% THC. So I also want to let everyone know that it is something that is bigger than we think it is. And we started talking about Juul already when we were looking at that video. And so when we're talking about what's changed, Juul is the thing that changed the game. Juul is the thing that changed how the delivery system was put in place and how people could interact with marijuana in general. Now, when we're talking about marijuana potency, we're not just talking about people smoking marijuana more regularly. We're talking about marijuana being more potent in general. We're talking about plants actually having more THC extracted from them than CBD, or more THC extracted from them than any other chemical obtained in the marijuana plant. Now, there was one study that I wanted to cite too. It was done about dispensaries in Colorado. And what they said was the primary problem with the current available cannabis in dispensaries in Colorado is that the THC content is just not what it used to be. Prior to the 1990s, it was less than 2%. In the 1990s, it grew to 4%. And between 1995 and 2015, there has been, wait for it, a 212 increase in THC content in the marijuana flower. And in 2017, the most popular strains found in dispensaries in Colorado had a range of THC content from 17 to 28%, found in a popular strain called the Girl Scout cookie. Sadly, these plants producing high levels of THC are incapable of producing much CBD, which goes around 0.09% to 0.2%. Now, with marijuana specifically, what I had essentially explained in a lot of other, especially in this one right here, hashing out what 420 means for youth today, what I had talked about was that in the marijuana plant, in the traditional marijuana plant, when chemicals are extracted, about 40% of those chemicals are actually CBD. Yeah, so there is weed. Yeah, no, it is just a name. It's actually called the Girl Scout cookie, and it's just a name. But because it does talk about, and what they had done was that because this plant has so much THC in it, it's just all the good stuff that gets people high. Yeah, so I find that really funny, definitely. And it is something that I thought was very clever in the naming. But when we're sort of talking about marijuana, it's understanding that marijuana, CBD, is supposed to be 40% of the plant. But because there are many different strains here, because the marijuana potency, because of the THC potency specifically is happening, there's going to be less than 1% compared to the traditional 40% of CBD in a traditional marijuana flower or plant. Now, that can be concerning for a lot of reasons, but more so understanding that THC is something that is addictive. It is something that is the psychosomatic part of the marijuana plant. It is the psychoactive part of the marijuana plant, and it does get people high, and it does get people to want to go back to have that feeling again. So as we're going through that, I just wanted to make that clear. So, and we're sort of going to be talking about this. This is something that I want to talk about Gen Z, because one, why is it important to know what Gen Z is going through? Why is it important to know in general? And it's because when we have social struggles, it's because when things happen to us, it affects the way that we interact with our environment. And I have talked about this so many times, but once again, I will link the presentation below to something called adverse childhood experiences. And when a collective group experiences something that is traumatic, it can actually change the way they cope with the thing that happened to them. And there are a lot of things that we need to know about Gen Z. And this is one particular marketing firm. They're called Market Watch, and they do a lot of different things for Gen Z to talk about how they can market better to Gen Z, which is good and bad depending on how you look at it. And there was one thing, there were a couple of things that I wanted to read from. And they said, here are some of the things that we found. Gen Z was hit harder than any other generation in the workforce during COVID-19. So a lot of Gen Z had lost their jobs during the 2020 lockdown. Education has been upended for Gen Z, and so have their education plans. Actually, Gen Z is finding that they no longer want to go to college or university. There are a lot of different things that they want to do. They want to look at trades. They want to look at different post-secondary experiences, but not necessarily traditional four-year colleges. A next point that I wanted to make is Gen Z will put tremendous pressure on brands to take action on social issues, meaning that Gen Z places a lot of action and a lot of weight into the brands that they use, into the brands that they interact with, meaning that this isn't necessarily something that we've seen before. That accountability of brands themselves is something new and interesting and somewhat exciting to see how brands are actually navigating through that social strata, because it has not been happening up until this point. Also, Gen Z wants to make an impact on the world starting now, meaning Gen Z, they're just so excited. They're so ready to see what's out there. They're so ready to make a change. And that can be good. That can be a great thing, but also understand that when you want to make a change, that involves doing a lot of adult-like things. That involves interacting with a lot of things that may be traumatic in a lot of different ways. Now, I do want to preface, and I do want to say a disclaimer just very quickly, that we'll be talking about school shootings, and we will be talking about some deaths that are happening. And this is the cycle that I talked about here. But before we do that, I just want to preface with this YouTube video. It's actually Watch Mojo, in case anybody follows Watch Mojo on YouTube. And they do a lot of lists on their YouTube channel, but they had listed some that I thought were really important social struggles that Gen Z had gone through that maybe not a lot of people realized that they actually had to live through. One, the age of streaming services. So that's YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat has a streaming service. There's also streaming services like Netflix. The opioid crisis actually started with Gen Z. We have something in the chat. Oh, Twitch. Yes, also, thank you. Twitch is also a streaming service. They also went through the policy of no child left behind. If you are ever wondering what that looks like, that essentially means that this policy was meant to say that even if someone is failing or unable to reach the educational standards that they needed to, then they were still pushed through to the next grade. There was also the decline of Facebook, and that their parents use Facebook differently than they do, meaning their parents actually essentially are starting to overshare on Facebook. This is the specific site, overshare on Facebook, while they are actually undersharing. They interact with social media differently than their parents. The 2008 financial crisis, the March for Our Lives, which was the school shootings, the Me Too movement, political divide on a scale that we have not seen before, the rise of influencers, the creation of a ubiquity of smartphones. So smartphones is definitely something much more common, and COVID-19. So those were all the social struggles and all the social events that they have lived through up to thus far that were really intense. Now, I have used this this graphic before, and my apologies if this is triggering. I'll just sort of talk through this as we go forward and be as sensitive to the information as possible. But this is the site itself. And they talked about 10 years. So this is up to 2019, 10 years, 180 school shootings, 356 victims. And they sort of break down what happened. They sort of talk about how many had passed away. They talked about the school shootings and where they had occurred, the time that they had occurred, the racial factors involved as well, and what a little bit more on the racial factors as well, and some of the victims, as well as the geographical locations. And they talk about methodology of how they obtained this information. So this is a great resource for people to understand what Gen Z may be going through, and what I don't think anybody else in their school system has really had to interact with, has really had to think about. There are so many different ways that Gen Z has had to live through the ramifications of the older generation's actions, or of the things that had happened to them because of the way that the world changed, and to no fault of their own, but just because to what happened. And the reason why I talk about this, and the reason why we need to understand this, is because social struggles and social interaction does change the way that people, one, work online, two, interact with their peers, and three, the way that they view themselves. And there was another poll that was done here by the American Psychology Association. It was done in 2018 by it's a Harris poll done on behalf of APA. And they said specifically 75% of Gen Z members said that mass shootings are a significant source of stress, according to the survey. This was conducted online, and it was among about 3,500 adults-ish, or 3,500 adults and 315 to 17-year-olds. Gen Z members are also more stressed than adults overall. 57% of Gen Z versus 45% of all adults reported the issue is a significant source of stress. And they said sexual harassment and assault reports were 53% versus 39%. This generation is all significantly more likely to than other generations, including millennials, to report their mental health as fair or poor, meaning 27% reported that their mental health was fair or poor. They also are more likely, 37%, along with millennials, 35%, to report that they have received therapy or treatment from a mental health professional, compared to 26% of Gen Xers. So this is something that we need to look at, because what they are also seeing, and what we are also seeing, is that, oh, my apologies. They also said Gen Z are more stressed than adults overall than other issues in the news, such as separation and deportation of immigrant and migrant families, 57% compared to 45%. Now, what this shows us, and what this poll helps us understand, is that social struggles are not just felt on a societal level. They are felt individually with each person who absorbs this information, who absorbs these numbers, that absorbs this news, and internalizes it to their own stress, internalizes it to their own mental health. And when people have their mental health issues, when people have mental health disorders, when people have things that they feel that are really hard for them to understand, turning to substances can be one way for them to do that. Now, I have one last slide on lower perceived risk here, and there were some articles on here that they were talking about. The 2019 crime survey for England and Wales showed that drug use among 16 to 24-year-olds was at a 16-year high, in part driven by an increase in coke use. The ONS data showed 73% increase in young adults who had taken coke in 2019 compared to 2013. Now, this is interesting for a lot of reasons, but for us to understand that drug use in certain areas definitely is up. But overall, Gen Z is actually perceived to use substances less than other generations because they want authenticity. Now, there was a couple of other things that I wanted to talk about here. There was a picture in this article specifically that I thought was really interesting. And they were talking about percentage of high school students who used illicit drugs, injected illegal drugs, and ever misused prescription opioids. The trend, good thing, and this is a good thing, is that it's going down. And the only reason why this in particular is because they had not collected that data before at that point. So as we can see, it was 22.6% of the total high school students use illicit drugs, down to 14%. Now, obviously 14% isn't great, but what we are understanding is that there is a downward trend on illicit drug use and drug use in general. So that is something to keep in mind. I also wanted to look at the county/PCMC survey. That will actually be linked in the description below, because there basically are the same numbers. And because it was skewed for 2020, I don't want to just put it out there to let people know this is how people feel. But because people were indoors, because there was a lot happening in 2020, there was a trend to say that parents were more likely to let their kids drink when they were around, to also possibly engage in a lot more, to basically essentially to talk about how they would allow their children to drink in front of them versus on their own. Also, they talked about children, Gen Z age especially, that said that they they were much more lackadaisical on the marijuana approach. And because marijuana is legalized now, we're definitely going to see that trend going in one direction versus another. And also a perceived risk that a lot of people are talking about. And I do want to say that if you do come in contact with something like this, everyone is doing it thing, understand when you combat this, try to reframe it for the youth that you're interacting with. If they say everyone is doing it, you should say, or you could say, well, if everyone is doing it, who are you hanging around that it's everyone? If everyone is doing it, then how come I see Joe Schmo, who is also in your class, volunteering on the weekends? So everyone is such an absolute statement that it doesn't encompass holistically exactly what Gen Z is doing and what they actually are looking like in terms of data. So last but not least, to always end my presentations with quotes, just so we can understand where we're coming from, and to holistically sort of surmise all of the things that we're talking about. Now, I have one that says, for every one person that says it's okay, it's going to be okay, I want someone else to come up and say, no, it's not, and I'll help you through it. Which I think is a lot more powerful statement than saying everything's going to be okay, because sometimes things really don't feel okay, especially with the social struggles, especially with the things that are happening in the world that Gen Z feels so helpless to interact with, that they may turn to other things to sort of mitigate some of the pain that they feel. And for us to say, you know what, in order to for us to mitigate those risk factors, in order for us to intervene, we need to say, you know what, you're right. It's not necessarily going to be okay, but we're going to help you through it anyway. And here are the resources that we can do that with. Also, I have another one over here that says an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And that's actually by Benjamin Franklin, to say that the preventive education that we do is a mitigating risk factor, especially for Gen Z, because they need to understand their bodies, they need to understand their brains, and for them to second guess their hard decisions to make sure that they're making the best choices for themselves, their bodies, their families, and anyone else they interact with. So thank you so much for being here. I appreciate your time and efforts, and I look forward to seeing you next week.